For those who have just joined absolutely on the dot of 11 a.m, we're just going to give it a minute to bring everyone in. Hello everyone, it's now 1 minute past 11, so we are going to kick up proceedings and let other people join us. Thank you everyone for attending Make UK's post-budget debrief webinar. This is the first one of these we have done. We normally send out a little email to all of our members saying then what happened in the budget and what it means for manufacturers. We thought it'd be really useful today just to give you the live version, where you'll hear from members of the policy team and our expert panel today. You'll have the opportunity to ask them questions. Any questions that we know, we will of course answer, and any questions that we don't know, just in case you throw any out of them at us, we will feed back into government and get a response. I'm just going to quickly introduce the panel, then I'll talk a little bit about the kind of context of which the budget was set yesterday, and then I'm going to hand over to the experts. So on our panel today, we have Faheen, our senior economist, who's going to talk a little bit later about the economic forecast and that hot topic of energy. We've got Jamie, who's going to talk about labour shortages, and we're going to find out whether the Chancellor actually took some action to mitigate labour shortages in manufacturing. And James, who's going to cover an array of topics, including R&D and indeed investment zones. So in terms of yesterday's budget, the Chancellor got up and spoke for an hour, a considerable amount of time for a budget. For those of you who listened intently, you'll notice that even in his opening lines, the Chancellor talked about industrial strategy, which is quite interesting because it was the first time we've heard those words from government in indeed a long time. But when it comes to industrial strategy, the Chancellor is very much focused on his 4 E's around education, enterprise, employment and everywhere. So not quite the industrial strategy as we would see normally, but you'll hear all those themes throughout as we go through our panellists. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Faheen to talk a little bit about the economic forecast.
Good morning, everyone. So yesterday, of course, it was quite interesting what we've seen from how the OBR has approached the forecasting. We also obviously know that at the start of this year, the government had a slightly bigger tax revenue package than they were expecting. And what we've seen a slightly more optimistic revision to many of the forecasts that the OBR have laid out. OBR expects now that CPI inflation rate will fall to around 2.9% by the end of 2023. That's significantly lower than what we are today, which is around 10%. And we expect to maybe average out about 6.1%. That is still pretty historically high and very far from the Bank of England's target of 2%, but it does suggest that the economy now currently expects that inflation rate will begin to cool, and our own surveys do indicate that as well. We do expect this year, and the OBR's expectation is that we will avoid a technical recession, so that is back-to-back quarters of GDP decline, or it is 2 consecutive quarters of decline. However, they expect that this year we will still have a decline overall in GDP of 0.2%. which is slightly more optimistic than our own forecast, which you can see on the right-hand side on the orange table, where we expect GDP to decline by 0.4% this year, but still avoid a technical recession. Overall, long-term 2024, the OBR expects that the UK will expand by 1.8% next year and by 2.5% in 2025, which I think is a very big, ambitious target for the UK, which, we will probably be more skeptical about in the 2025 target. Other forecasts, I think it's worth mentioning that the OBR have revised down their unemployment rate forecast to 4.4%, and we expect the debt as a share of GDP to also fall to be lower every year between 2027 and 2028. Interestingly, and my colleague will obviously move on to this later on investment, but the pro-investment incentive policies that government are introducing, the OBR expects that this will result in business investment expanding by 3.5% by next year. So I think that is quite a substantial increase if that does come to pass. I think it's always good to be wary of economic forecasts, and I'll pass on just in a moment, but I think we should expect these numbers to be revised, I think, multiple times this year as well. I'll leave it at that, Verity.
Brill, thank you. And apologies, I should have said from the start, if you have any questions during the course of this webinar, please do use the Q&A function and we will get those answered. So Fahim, in terms of forecasts, obviously there's quite strong expectations for growth that we perhaps haven't seen previously. Do we think this really chimes with what we're seeing when we go out and speak to manufacturers, or indeed the economist in you? Do you feel like this is too optimistic, or do you think this is about the right track?
Yeah, our own surveys and our conversations with members have been indicating that the first quarter of this year, at least, has been surprisingly more buoyant than many would have expected for the start of 2023. I think that is also being observed within the rest of the economy, not just in the manufacturing sector, and also the more positive than expected tax revenue that the government achieved in I think it was 5 billion more than they initially projected for Q1 this year, suggests that the economy is probably moving in a slightly better direction than initially forecast. So these revisions are still, I think, sensible, but I think the OBR has remained, I guess, cautioned but they do still expect the UK to decline this year, just by not as much. I think it's worth mentioning that the IMF predicts that the UK will be the worst performing country amongst the G7 this year in GDP growth, in terms of being the only country to not recover its pre-pandemic GDP. Alongside these OBR forecasts, that still remains to be true. So I think there are still areas that we need to keep an eye on.
Well, thanks, Fahim. Well, a little bit of positivity, which is always nice to hear. I mean, of course, forecasts and knowing that we are walking into more of a positive picture than perhaps we were seeing towards the end of last year is really important for investment. So, James, was there anything that the Chancellor announced yesterday that will really spur on that much needed investment?
Thanks, Verity, and good morning, everyone. I think it's fair to say with the announcements yesterday, there's more ups than downs when it comes to the investment outlook and those policies that the government are implementing to boost investment. It comes at a time, of course, as a quick recap, where the super deduction is becoming defunct, and it's being replaced now with a full expensing scheme. For those of you that are unaware of what the super deduction scheme was, it was a 130% first-year capital allowance for qualifying investment in plant and machinery that has run for the past 2 years and ends in about 2 weeks. It is now being replaced by a scheme called full expensing. And it's also, as was mentioned in the Chancellor's statement yesterday, it's fairly critical that some sort of pro-investment policy came along as far as league tables are concerned, as the UK, without such a scheme compared to the other OECD nations, falls quite low on the table in terms of pro-business investment policy without such a scheme. It's been a long road to get here to this full expensing scheme. We've been very hard at work over the past year or so, and a lot of work from Treasury as well, running consultations, lots of in-person roundtables, so on and so forth, on hashing out just what a successor to the super deduction would look like. There were 4 to 5 main options on the table, some of which we've seen come to pass already, which is the permanent extension to the annual investment allowance of £1 million, Something that was on the table but didn't come to pass was essentially a permutation, an extended permutation of the super deduction that was 120% as opposed to 130%. Full expensing, which at the outset with the government was seen as quite a far out shot of us managing to secure that for the industry, and through quite a lot of work from ourselves and other business groups has become more of a reality over time and come to its actual passing yesterday. And finally, there was another option that was on the table around writing down expenses for specific business goods, mainly around logistics, such as vans and cars and the like. An important point to note is where the super deduction fell down and where it was criticised and where it was happily received. And also its time length period was a challenge. Of course, the super deduction was launched at a time where businesses were very strapped on cash in the post-COVID world. So, of course, despite the apparent generosity of 130% tax allowance, the amount of businesses that were capital rich enough to make investments in that immediate post-COVID environment was limited. So take-up was perhaps smaller than many businesses would have liked to at the time had they been more capital rich. Hopefully now, 2 years on, more businesses will be able to benefit from this scheme, as they should be in a better capital or liquidity position to invest. However, two of the major pitfalls and major concerns that were raised by yourselves, by our members, at the time of the super deduction announcements and throughout its existence are the exclusions of leased goods and the exclusions of second-hand goods, which disproportionately affect smaller businesses. Those exclusions have carried through into the new full expensing scheme, which is a 100% first-year capital allowance based on all qualifying plant and machinery expenditure. This I should mention as well, this scheme is set to run for 3 years, which is a win over the previous instance of super deduction was 2 years. However, we have made comment, while this is an improvement, that we would ideally like to see a little bit more permanency, and if not permanent, perhaps a 5-year or ideally longer, to better reflect the manufacturing business investment cycle that we know to be between 5 and 10 years. And of course, we still remain at a time where, due to the onslaught of costs on business costs, the amount of spare liquidity and capital within businesses to make and plan these capital expenditures is still limited compared to what we have seen in the past. So I've mentioned the gains and the losses. I think it should also be mentioned as well, to add a little bit of sobriety to the proceedings, that while it's a real success that we've managed to see full expensing turn up in the Chancellor's announcement after calling for it for so long, is that the total expected amount of expenditure is thought to be around £11 billion over the course of the 3 years that the full expensing runs. That is in comparison to the 25 billion that is expected to have been paid out throughout the duration of the super deduction scheme. Now, of course, we'll see exact figures when HMT will publish documents in hindsight around use of the super deduction scheme, probably in a few months or under a year's time. But of course, we can see that's less than half of the total amount of payouts. So what that means for total amount of support money supported into pro-business investment will likely be less. It should be mentioned as well that in our latest manufacturing outlook research, that we've seen 4 quarters of investment intentions from the industry crawl downwards into what we saw in the final quarter of last year, where they actually turned negative. Quite encouragingly, we've seen, along with, I suppose it goes with the improvement in the economic outlook and improvement with forecasts, that we've seen investment intentions actually improve this quarter, and we'll be publishing data on that in just a couple of weeks' time with our first quarter manufacturing outlook report. But perhaps this scheme will come at a good time where we're seeing those investment intentions start to grow and grow significantly within the sector, just as a new pro-business investment policy comes out, which claims to be simple to interact with and simple to relieve oneself off as a business. I'll move now on to research and development.
I guess just before you quickly move on, James, in terms of that excluding of second-hand equipment and leasing, I mean, on leasing, Treasury were very, said to us yesterday that it can be subject to fraud, and they'd quite like to work with us going forward to find a solution. But on second-hand equipment, to what extent do manufacturers purchase second-hand equipment over buying new equipment? You know, how important is it? Is there a size dynamic to that?
Sure, and I should say that while perhaps the top concerns around the previous scheme, the super deduction, were its time frame first of all, but then secondly the exclusions of leasing and second-hand goods. That exclusion affects a small proportion of the sector, but that small proportion of the sector are those smaller businesses. And something that we see in our manufacturing outlook data that we saw at the announcement and throughout the super deduction scheme, and we're actually seeing in this latest data, is that the propensity to commit to the next 12 months of capital investment, we're seeing a bit of a dichotomy between those smaller businesses and those larger businesses, where those smaller businesses are not confident enough to invest. And perhaps it's because those larger businesses have a greater cash buffer in order to take those greater risks. And so our concern is making sure that pro-business investment policy doesn't have any regressive features to it, to make sure that actually in a perfect world, we see those smaller businesses incentivized to invest perhaps above and beyond those large businesses. And our concern is that we know from our data that it is those smaller businesses that are more likely to invest in leased capital or to invest in second-hand capital. We know from research we undertook last year as part of our investment health report, almost across the board, all manufacturers prefer to use new capital, as you would expect. But we understand that those significant high-risk investments for smaller businesses, often through leasing goods, will be an initial way into improving their productivity, improving their plant, perhaps due to lack of capital, or perhaps as a cautionary measure before going full on and buying the equipment outright.
Okay, and I know you're going to come on to R&D next, and that has, again, important elements in terms of small businesses who have faced quite significant changes. But on R&D, James, you want to talk us through the announcements made yesterday, because there was some positive noise around this, but as always, the devil is in the detail, right?
Sure. And so it's been trailed for a while that I suppose the headline point for the change to the R&D scheme is essentially, in layman's term, there's been a boom for those larger businesses and a detriment for those smaller businesses. And this detriment has been justified around abuse and fraud, which is a challenging concern for Treasury. And we actually know that the amount of I forget the technical term, but when they check the books, essentially the amount of people that have been hired to check, I think it's called an investigation or something like that, to check whether an R&D claim and the R&D books are correct and compliant, is more than tripled, or just under tripled, so that they can make the scheme more rigorous, because it has been a real concern for government and for our industry, the amount of not just fraudulent but also erroneous claims that have arisen as a result of the scheme, which of course makes the government nervous, and of course makes the benefit to those that are correctly using the scheme nervous as well, for fear of it being pulled, perhaps like what we're seeing a little bit today for the SME segment. So manufacturers account for about 64% of private sector expenditure on research and development. So that means 64p of every £1 spent on innovation is by the sector. And so the R&D tax credit has been a great benefit to the industry. And actually in previous research, we've seen that of all government schemes that manufacturers can relieve themselves of, R&D tax credits has been by way and afar the most popular. So we've been clear that we need to make sure that it's retained and indeed expanded in order to encourage even greater private investment in research and development. In our budget submission, we have asked to delay the changes to the R&D tax credit that are changing this April, and these changes were announced in the autumn statement of last year in 2022. So the decision to make the tax changes to the SME tax credit, which is the primary method to invest in innovation, is really quite a blow. It was announced yesterday that Treasury is going to go ahead with the SME additional deduction, and it will decrease from 130% to 86%. And the SME credit rate will decrease from 14.5% to 10%, which of course makes the SME scheme less generous. And we suspect the impact on SMEs will be profound. So as an illustration, one member company has estimated that will lose out by about 30% on their previous R&D tax relief due to the changes, and many others report similar levels of anticipated reduction. It should be mentioned, however, that an allowance was made and mentioned for SMEs but only those SMEs that almost exist solely to be research companies. So if 40%, if a total amount of expenditure or turnover, 40% is R&D, you're eligible for a boosted rate of SME tax credit. But of course, when we think about 40% of expenditure as R&D, you are quite likely to be in existence as a research company. And so that's going to affect a small subset of our sector. And so yesterday, the Chancellor also announced some additional changes that will take place in April of this year. So taking a loss-making SME as an example, they can currently receive £33.35 for every £100 spent on eligible R&D. However, from April next year, that same company will only receive £18.60 for £100 spent on eligible R&D, which is a reduction of 44%. In contrast, profit-making SMEs see a reduction of 13% in tax savings. So in conclusion, it's a bittersweet announcement. I mean, we welcome this small adjustment, but it creates more confusion and pain for businesses, and especially SMEs that need to rely, as they have been doing, on external service providers to help them navigate through the process, which of course takes money away from the taxpayer to actually see R&D realized.
Thanks, James. And to say we've done a lot of work with Treasury on this. I think it's, it's often frustrating when we can't see the delay or indeed reversal to the changes. But I think what we can do is really build on yesterday's announcement around the, the further support for more R&D intensive companies and perhaps lower that threshold so more of our members getting scope. Now, speaking about thresholds are really important when we're talking about energy. Fahim, energy, the biggest probably topic facing manufacturers right now. Did we see anything further from the Chancellor yesterday? Because I'm sure everyone on this call is really conscious that the current scheme, the EBRS, is about to be followed by the EBDS, and all of our analysis shows that it's not going to be that generous or indeed triggered. Talk us through what was announced yesterday, and perhaps what was missing.
Yeah, thank you, Verity. So I'll start off with that last bullet point then on energy costs. So yeah, as we are all aware, the household scheme for energy price guarantee was extended by the government yesterday until June, where people will not pay more than, or typical household will not pay more than £2,500 a year on their energy bills. We were hoping to see that sort of extension applied to the business community as well on the EBRS, the Energy Bills Relief Scheme, but that was not to be the case, and it's been confirmed it will expire at the end of this month to be replaced by the Energy Bills Discount Scheme, which splits into two tiers: those who are on the Universal Scheme, which will be applied to all businesses, and those who are on the Energy Trade Intensive Industry Scheme, which is a select group of SITCOs that have been selected by government that will get a more generous scheme. What we have seen, although it's good that the government has committed to a longer term scheme, the previous scheme was only 6 months long and the new one will be now 12 months in length. Given how wholesale prices in gas and electricity have been moving for the majority of manufacturers, to the 77% of businesses in manufacturing who would not qualify for the higher tier scheme, they would never actually see the benefit of this discount unless you were one of those businesses who happened to, agree a tariff with your energy provider sometime in the middle of last year, around June, July, August, where you probably are currently on a really, really bad deal for energy prices compared to what energy is worth today. May see some benefit, but even for those businesses, the discount itself is not that generous anyway, and it's likely to not benefit you. So I think ideally for businesses who are in that situation, that the best move you can make is to try to renew your tariffs with your energy provider as quickly as possible to try and get yourselves down to the current rates on energy costs. But we're unlikely to see any further support from government on specifically the cost of energy today. Now, going back a little bit, what we did see from the budget is a focus on perhaps energy investment and focuses in energy efficiency in the future. Nuclear was a big topic, I think, for the budget yesterday. Great British Nuclear is a scheme launched to address the constraints in the nuclear market to support investment in small modular reactors. So we're thinking small at the moment before we go into big plants that produce huge amounts of nuclear energy for the entire nation. Interestingly, what the government is doing is they're redefining the nuclear energy as a source into the same classification as a source of renewable energy. So there is redefined as sustainable source of energy. So it would be in the same classification as solar, wind power, and hydro and all these sort of things, which would mean that nuclear would effectively fall into the same tax exemptions that would apply to other green forms of energy. How is that going to work long term? It really depends, because nuclear it can be a renewable source of energy depending on how you actually access it. Not going to go into the science of it, but there are multiple ways of producing renewable nuclear energy, one of which is a renewable way and the other, another which is not. So, what does it mean if you put it into the same category as a solar and wind? But this would be subject to a consultation, so it's not happening from the 1st of April or anything. The second area that we've seen is a big focus on carbon capture, usage and storage, which I think the UK is looking to be a leading pioneer of. £20 billion fund investing in the early deployment of climate commitments on carbon capture, usage and storage. That's of course not immediately, that's over a timescale, and we're not going to see any benefits of that, I think, until at least 2030. And most of that work will be taking place in the East Coast, the Northwest and Northern Wales, but it is expected to produce jobs in those locations, and so it's a commitment towards leveling up as well for the government. I think an interesting area that the government overlooked, or at least did not mention in the budget, is how they're going to be treating tax treatments for oil and gas companies who dispose of assets related to oil and gas extraction. If they were to donate those assets for carbon capture, usage and storage, then the government is looking to introduce legislation that would actually effectively give those companies tax breaks. But whether this would impact manufacturers remains to be seen. It really depends on the definition of gas assets. Some manufacturers especially those who are gas intensive, may also have their own gas assets that they have to dispose of after a certain number of years. Whether they can also contribute by donating those assets to carbon capture, usage and storage and benefit from those tax breaks, I think is something that we'll need to look into a little bit further. The final thing I wanted to look at is the extension of the climate change agreement. This is something that we have been asking for, particularly on opening the scheme to new entrants, which was initially closed, so new businesses will be able to access that scheme. And those who, and I think from what I understand is, it's essentially you commit to certain energy efficiency targets. If you meet those targets, then you'll be able to benefit from tax breaks or from the climate change levy in 2025, 2026 or 2026, 2027. The interesting thing in how this particular extension of the climate change agreement works with the changing in the definition of nuclear energy is that now nuclear energy would also contribute to achieving those targets of energy efficiency. So if you, as a business, were to invest in, I don't think we're there yet, but small modular reactors yourselves, and that would also contribute to the climate change agreement targets that you may have on yourself. Although I think that remains to be seen. And of course, other than that, there wasn't too much else on energy. I think we would have liked to have seen more. But given how the energy markets is cooling off at the moment, I don't think the government currently sees that as a priority, but I think it still remains a huge issue for manufacturers who remain energy intensive and are still paying quite a lot. So I'll stop there.
Well, thanks, Maheen. And I think, one of the comments that has just come up in the chat is, nothing on the business rates reevaluation either. So it does feel like the end of this month is slightly a cliff edge in terms of, business rates. We'll have increases to the national living wage. We'll have the end of the super deduction and indeed the end of the EBRS. So it'll be interesting if people have kind of comments about how they feel, April onwards looks for them in terms of their outlook. Now, if manufacturers aren't talking to us about energy, they tend to be talking to us about skills. Jamie, huge labour shortage right now. What did the Chancellor announce to really help get, particularly, I think the focus was those who are economically inactive back into work?
Yeah, thanks, Verity. You will know from the news headlines today and earlier in the week that the Chancellor was really keen to frame this as a back-to-work budget. And so there were lots of areas that were covered in the statement yesterday around getting people back into work who have left the workforce in recent months or the last couple of years. But also around preventing other people leaving the workforce due to ill health, people approaching retirement, parents, grandparents, other people with caring responsibilities. So yeah, you're right, this was a big focus yesterday, and it's something that we've been engaging with government on a huge amount over the last few weeks and months to shape the development of policy in this area. So in terms of what was announced for over 50s, the big announcement for that particular group was returnerships. And I think it's worth clarifying actually exactly what this entails, what it includes and what it doesn't. Jeremy Hunt referred to this yesterday as a new type of apprenticeship. Actually, when you look at the detail in the Red Book and speak to officials, there's really nothing particularly new about it, other than it is a sort of a rebadged group of skills policy interventions that have previously been in place, but are sort of being made more attractive, or the intention is to make them more attractive to that age group. So what we have in returnerships is a kind of a rebranding of an existing approach to what government calls accelerated apprenticeships. So that's where, when you recruit an apprentice, usually at a sort of intermediate to higher level, where they have prior learning or significant amount of work experience, you can negotiate a shorter length or a reduced financial cost of that apprenticeship training, as long as it continues to meet sort of other funding rules. So if you are sort of putting someone on an apprenticeship who has been working with you for a long time, or has been working in sort of skilled work for a long time, it means that you can reduce the length of that apprenticeship and negotiate a lower price with your training provider. An expansion of skills boot camps, they have been around now for a few years. That sort of short, sharp training focused predominantly on digital and technical skills. And there's a bit of additional funding announced for those to be expanded, and sector-based work academy programs, which primarily, again, sort of relatively short, sharp technical training aimed at people who are currently out of work. So the returnership is basically not specifically one of those things. It's not an apprenticeship, but it is a choice for those people who are currently out of work, who want to return, need a refresher of their skills. There are a number of options there for those people to choose from. And so government is using returnership as a kind of umbrella term to incorporate all of those, on the basis that they feel, probably rightly, that that particular age group don't necessarily want to feel like they're being sent to something called a skills boot camp. If there's someone with a significant amount of work experience, they might not want to feel like they're being called an apprentice. So it's a rebadging of all of that stuff to make it more attractive to that group of people. The other thing that was announced specifically in relation to over 50s was an expansion of the midlife MOT model. That's something that government has rolled out again over the last few years. And that's really with the intention of trying to provide a sort of framework for employers and their employees to have a constructive, flexible, individualized sort of conversation about approaching retirement, to make sure that they have the right things in place for them to make the right decision for them. If they need access to training, if they are moving into part-time work, whatever that might look like for them and for you as an employer, to sort of promote that sort of conversation, rather than sort of ending up with a bit of a cliff edge for both the employee and the employer as the employee moves into their sort of early 60s and really get towards retirement age. Moving on to childcare, and this was obviously the big headline from yesterday and has been a topic of political discussion and media discussion for a number of weeks now in terms of the cost and affordability of childcare for working parents. So the big announcement was the expansion of the 30 hours free childcare entitlement to parents of children over 9 months, which will be introduced in increments over the next 2.5 years. That will start with 15 hours free entitlement for parents of 2-year-olds from 2024. In September 2024, that will be expanded to incorporate children of 9 months and upwards. And then that will increase to a 30 hours free entitlement for those groups from September 2025. So those new entitlements kind of build on what is already available. They follow the same eligibility criteria. They interact in the same way with things like tax-free childcare. Some of the same kind of rules and restrictions apply. So around sort of parents, both parents have to be in work to benefit from that entitlement. So worth bearing in mind if you've got sort of people in training who might be looking to access childcare entitlements. Those rules still exist around both parents being in work. The other thing, in addition to the 30 hours free entitlement, is the increase in wraparound childcare provided by schools. That will be rolled out by 2026, and will be sort of provided by schools between 8 a.m. and 6 p.m. Parents will have to pay to access that, and schools will be funded to provide it. The other element of childcare is just around universal credit, where there is more upfront support and increased coverage in universal credit for childcare costs. When we talk to government about affordability and accessibility of childcare, on accessibility, that will be done mainly through, I suppose, sort of broadly supply side reforms in terms of the childcare market. So things you will have seen yesterday around increasing staff to child ratios, additional funding from government for childcare providers, with the aim of not just improving the affordability of provision for parents, but actually the accessibility and the capacity in the system to provide childcare. The final area, and one where we've been engaging quite a lot, is on long-term health and disability. A couple of things worth noting on this front. In terms of occupational health, there have been lots of conversations with government on this recently, and there'll be 2 consultations. One will look at where tax incentives can play a part in where employers are able to invest more. We've heard a lot in the last few weeks from our members about how they would like to do more to support their employees' health and well-being. But frankly, cost in the current environment can be a really significant barrier. So we'd push quite hard for government to explore where the tax system can be used to support employers to do more. So I think welcome that there is going to be a consultation on that, although perhaps they could have done more in the short term to support employers on that front. The other consultation will be whether they consider actually something a little bit more radical to increase occupational health coverage. that could be legislating to effectively require employers to provide a minimum level of service or entitlement to their employees in terms of accessing health and wellbeing services. And we'll be feeding into that something which could require actually not just a policy change from government, but a really big culture change in how employers are expected to think about the ways in which they support the health and well-being of their workforce, and actually in terms of the occupational health market as well, whether there is enough good quality, suitable provision out there for employers to access if that were to become a requirement.
Thanks,
government
Jamie.
also...
Oh, sorry.
Sorry.
I've stopped you in your tracks. Keep on going. Market.
Just the very final point, which is there is a small step announced in terms of health and wellbeing. So there will be a pilot scheme which will subsidise SMEs to access occupational health. So that kind of rounds off the health and disability bit. And I would just say, to summarise the sort of back to work segment of the budget, I think we believe that these are all small steps in the right direction. They are small steps. We think government is looking at broadly the right areas. We know that health, childcare, early retirement are all playing a part in labour shortages in manufacturing at the moment. But there is much more to do, and much more that we would have liked to have seen yesterday from the Chancellor.
And one of the things we would have liked to have seen, and just conscious that I've got questions and still one more slide which will hopefully answer one of those questions, is the shortage occupation list. Obviously massive labour shortages right now, not just actually in the UK but also outside of it. But easing of the migration system, political hot potato, but we have been calling on the review of the shortage occupation list. Did we see that in the detail of the budget book yesterday?
We saw a little bit. So we know from a couple of weeks ago that government has started that process properly, which is really positive. I'd just say two quick things that were included yesterday. One is that government has committed to reviewing that list more regularly, which is really positive. There's been a huge gap in between the current review and the previous review, which means that the current list of shortage occupations is really out of date. So that's really positive. And secondly, we've seen government willing to be flexible in sectors like construction, adding occupations to that list where there are significant shortages actually straight away. So we'll be making a really robust case over the next few weeks while government is consulting to take a similar approach to manufacturing occupations so that it's easier for employers in our sector to recruit from overseas where they need to.
Brilliant. And for anyone on the call that wants to feed into that work, do just get in contact with Jamie, because we need as much evidence that we can to get those job roles on. Right, with just a few minutes to spare, I'm going to go to the final slide, but I'm going to preempt it with a question because I think this might tackle it in James's narrative around investment zones. So the question, James, was how do you think the establishment of investment zones with their tax incentives and grant funding will affect manufacturing businesses located within these zones? And will this lead to regional imbalances? Feels like another kind of free ports debate. Talk us through what we know about these investment zones so far and see if you can answer Nicholas's question.
Sure, absolutely. And I will. I think I do have an answer to that question as well. Those of you with eagle eyes might remember that these investment zones were a moment of focus during the short-lived premiership of Liz Truss. They're back again, of a similar concept when they were designed or reiterated by that previous administration, whereas the new focus now of these investment zones is less so about low trade barrier areas and more around fostering partnerships between academic institutions and the private sector, with the ultimate goal of seeing the UK's leading research academic research institutes seeing their outputs commercialized. That is the goal and the ambition of this scheme, and by the benefit will be to cluster those companies, generate local prosperity, generate local jobs, and so on. So those areas have been identified. all of them away from London, with one each in, at least one each, I should say, in Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland. There'll be 80 million up for grabs, which can be used flexibly, but it needs to be identified and set up in the first instance by local authorities and local government as to how and where these investment zones, specifically and through which partnerships they will be forged. To the question, now we did notice, and this was a while back at the previous iteration, so it's unlikely to have changed, but it may have done, which is that the benefits to those that happen to be within an area, it was not extended to those that happen to be within an area. It was to those that explicitly are set up or take part of that cluster that is being set up. So this was a question that popped up a lot at the last iteration when this topic was last discussed, and our latest understanding was that by just through sheer happenstance, if your business and or plant happens to be located within those zones, you don't necessarily benefit from the benefits provided to that scheme. Now that may have changed, and it's something we're going to look into. Of course, the budget was only announced yesterday, and it's a very, very large piece of paper that attaches to it. But even then, a lot of the detail isn't explicit. We've already had that challenge around the new capital allowances offer, as we were just talking about earlier, around exclusions, because even with the reams of paperwork that have come out, it is not steadfastly sure what is and is not excluded. And so the same can be said for investment zones, to your question. So I hope that goes some way to answering your question, which is previously it was not. So those businesses. The second part of your question is, do you think it will create regional imbalances? I think not. And I think perhaps for a rather pessimistic reason, not because a grand success of a Singapore-style microstate within the UK would create trade imbalances, but I think because of the focus on commercializing our leading academic research, which is where the sort of focus is, I don't think they will have that effect, which I think has been discussed in the past, which turns them into micro super trading states within a state, and thus causing a mad rush of businesses into them to the behest of other local communities and other businesses that aren't located or cannot locate within them. So a bit of a bittersweet take there, not because I predict their downfall so much so, but I don't quite think that that's our ambition in this latest iteration.
Brilliant. Thank you, James. I'm conscious of time now that we've done that classic thing that we do in the policy team where we speak far too much and go over time. There was one other question, I think, particularly that came up, and I'm sure there are more questions to follow, but if you do have a question, you can always just email any of us directly, or we'll also put our overall policy email address in the chat. But there was one just around, how do the R&D changes compare to our international competitors? Without putting any of our panelists on the spot, if I kind of come in on that, I think that what we've seen from government in terms of the changes to the R&D tax relief scheme, particularly for SMEs, has actually put us at an international disadvantage. If we look to other countries such as Germany, it has far more attractive tax incentive, and I think it's about a 25% R&D tax credit. So arguably we are potentially moving further behind. We see in the cases of Ireland and Singapore, both have kind of highly attractive business tax structures, and by doing so, actually what they see is better rates on return on investment, as well as access to capital and other financial incentives. So whilst I don't want to put a negative spin on it, I think there is that slight worry that actually if we don't really look at the potential impact of these changes, particularly for small businesses, the UK could lag behind. And actually if we really want to take advantage of the innovations that we see within the manufacturing sector, actually making sure those policy levers are in place to allow that to happen will be really important, and that's the message that we would take back to government. As I mentioned, we've already run over time. For anyone who is listening to this on the recording and tried to get in and failed, apologies if there was technical issues. You can, wonderfully as it is on the screen, always email the policy team at makeuk@makeuk.org. If you've got any feedback that you want us to take to government, that is what we're here for. Do also follow us on Twitter on @MakeUK-Campaigns, and you can even subscribe to a weekly newsletter where we'll give you all the rounds up of all of these big announcements. But I'd like to just thank you all very much for joining, and we will be circulating the slides and the recording in due course. Thank you everyone, and have a wonderful day.